In the year 1480, Confucian courtiers ransacked the imperial archives. They sought to destroy every trace of one of the Ming dynasty's greatest achievements. The logbooks of the Starfleet, the greatest armada of wooden ships ever assembled, were consigned to the flames. From the smoke and ashes of that fire came a mystery that would tantalize the world. Just how far had China's imperial fleet pushed the boundaries of the known world? Could it have even reached America before Christopher Columbus?
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
A remarkable man stands at the heart of this great mystery. His name was Zheng He, still revered as a god in parts of the East. Once a hero in China. The most powerful of the court eunuchs. His loyalty in battle brought him great rewards. The emperor made him admiral of the Ming fleet. In 30 tumultuous years, his fleet of 300 ships and some 28,000 men undertook 7 epic voyages. Until recently, that saga was neglected and little known outside China. But in China, some traditional storytellers have never forgotten the heroic exploits of the great Zheng He.
The emperor declared, "Who is willing to take the command and go to the Western Ocean as my marshal?" Zheng he has been rewarded for his bravery. He is a talent. But he is too old. What a pity. No, no, I say. The older the ginger, the hotter it is.
One man, more than anyone else, was to spread Zheng He's fame to the West. In 2002, a retired submarine commander called Gavin Menzies delivered a sensational lecture at the Royal Geographical Society in London.
Someone was in the Caribbean in 1424, 70 years before Columbus.
Menzies had delivered a bombshell. Menzies argued that in 1421, almost a century before Magellan, Zheng He's fleet had circumnavigated the world. He has expanded his theories in a best-selling book. If Menzies was right, Zheng He had reached the New World before any European explorer. For years, Zheng He's grave lay virtually unnoticed, tended only by his family in Nanking.
For almost 600 years, the family came here quietly, with no fuss. Very few people even knew the tomb was here.
The full extent of Zheng He's 7 voyages is now a subject of intense interest and controversy.
Of course, he was to lose his life on the 7th voyage. His tomb contains nothing but his clothes and shoes.
So much has been lost or destroyed, but Zheng He's story can be pieced together from inscriptions on the stone tablets he erected.
The emperor sent envoys to foreign lands to tame their barbarian habits
propagate
and instill in them our civilization.
Other fragments of information survive in provincial archives and imperial decrees, in an official history, a few surviving maps, and the memoirs of a translator who sailed with the fleet. This film will search for the true story of Zheng He's journeys.
Those who accompanied Zheng He on the fleet were regarded as heroes, and we worshipped them.
Zheng He sailed when Henry V was King of England, when most people thought the world was flat.
We have traversed immense waters. Behold waves like mountains, set eyes on far distant barbarian regions.
With clues ancient and modern, these two one-hour programs will follow in the wake of the mighty Starfleet.
Our sails unfurled like clouds, continuing their course.
The first program will trace the fleet's passage through ancient temples and trade routes to the ports of modern Asia, Arabia, and Africa. The second program will follow Gavin Menzies' theory to see how and if the fleet crossed the Atlantic to America. It was almost by accident that Gavin Menzies first stumbled on the story of the man he believes was the Chinese Columbus.
When I wrote the book, I pinned my evidence on the fact that the first European explorers all had charts showing them where they were going. Columbus had a map of the Caribbean. Magellan had a map of the world. Somebody discovered the world before Europeans did.
The maps of those early explorers have all disappeared, but maps indicating islands on the far side of the Atlantic have survived, and this convinced Menzies that someone must have mapped parts of the New World long before Columbus. To begin with, he thought it must have been the Portuguese.
So I went to the Portuguese ambassador in London, and he said, we'll introduce you to the keeper of the Torre de Tombo in Lisbon.
The Torre de Tombo is one of Portugal's great national libraries.
So I started going through the records.
If Menzies could prove that Portuguese explorers had crossed the Atlantic and mapped parts of the Caribbean before Columbus, it would be, by any standards, a world scoop. But what he found instead was evidence that led him to believe that as early as 1428, there had been a map of the world that predated those early Portuguese voyages of exploration. His source was a Portuguese historian, writing more than 100 years after the event, who claimed this map had indicated both the Cape of Good Hope and the Straits of Magellan. If there ever was such a map, it no longer exists. But Menzies was convinced.
Far from the Portuguese having discovered these islands in the Caribbean 70 years before Columbus, what in fact happened was that they didn't know about them. My whole book had to be rethought.
Years of research lay in ruins. Menzies drowned his sorrows in a bar in Lisbon, but a nagging question was left in his mind. If the Portuguese were not the first to map the far side of the Atlantic, who was?
England and France were at the end of the 100 Years' War. They were bust. Venice was in political turmoil. They were out of the picture. The Islamic world was, again, in complete turmoil. It could only be in China.
In 1402, China was centuries ahead of the West in learning and technology. This was the era of the Ming Dynasty, one that would last from 1368 to 1644. The third Ming emperor had just usurped the throne and was keen to stamp his authority on the vast country and state bureaucracy he now ruled.
This painting shows the prosperity of the Ming capital. Zhu Di saw himself as a great emperor. He wanted to surpass all his ancestors and build the greatest empire.
建立一个什么呢？不世的工业。
To enhance the prestige of his throne, the emperor sought to expand trade and diplomatic contacts with the outside world.
同时呢，也要和周边国家，是吧？
He wanted to improve the relations with neighboring countries. So Zheng He's mission was to be political. It aimed to spread and increase the power of the Ming dynasty.
永乐皇帝呢，也
The emperor encouraged the tribute system.
贸易的发展。各个国家的使团都
Indeed, ambassadors poured into the Chinese court to pay tributes, demonstrating the pulling power of the Chinese throne.
也就是说，你给我朝贡，
You pay us tributes, and we bestow benefits on you.
就是对别人
By giving you back in benefits more than your tributes were worth, we showed we were a more powerful country and maintained moral superiority. Very typical Chinese thinking.
我赏赐你，应该呢比你给我的东西要多。
His traditionally minded Confucian courtiers advised against an ambitious and expensive foreign policy. They maintained that China as a land power should be self-sufficient, turning its back on the barbarians beyond the seas. But Zhu Di believed that seeking wealth and renown abroad would secure his throne at home. So in 1403, he ordered that a great fleet be built. For the next 30 years, it would fly the flag around the Indian Ocean and extend the tribute network throughout the known world. Dockyards were made ready to build the fleet.
20 years ago, this was sea. The houses here were only built since then. You can imagine these buildings as Zheng He's treasure boats. And Zheng He's first task was to build more ships.
Amazingly, in the heart of the former capital, Nanjing, the great dry docks can still be seen 6 centuries later.
The people here told me that as late as 1949, these were still linked to the sea. The docks were enormous. The length was 1.5 miles. The width, 500 yards. They were made up of 7 dry docks. This is number 6. It is on record that the emperor once borrowed 10,000 workers from here to build a monument. So over 20,000 probably worked here. It must have been an extraordinary sight.
The fleet under construction consisted of several hundred ships, including a handful of giant treasure junks.
You see those wooden stakes? They were not to fortify the bank, but to support the boats from beneath so the workers could work on them. Here in 1957, we found a huge rudder, 11 yards long. I saw it myself.
Archaeologists concluded the rudder post was 600 years old and 33 feet long, part of an enormous junk. An entry in the Ming Annals says the ships were 44 zhang in length. That translates to over 400 feet, 5 times longer than the flagship of Christopher Columbus.
Treasure junks was recorded to be 50 yards wide and over 100 yards long. Were there such large ships? I think there were. Fujian has a long history of shipbuilding. We had very good natural materials, fir trees and pines. Of the 200 ships Zheng He had to build, the big boats must all have been built here.
This group of scholars and naval enthusiasts has raised the money to reconstruct a Ming junk. But they're still arguing about what size it should be.
The largest treasure boat was no more than 200 feet.
Too small, far too small.
My sources are accurate. This drawing is from Zheng He's time.
No. Experts agree a large boat with 3 layers of planks would be strong enough, and so would the keel. We checked it again and again.
With the technology and materials we have today, it's difficult to build such a big boat, but we cannot yet say it's impossible.
Many believe that 450-foot ships were feasible because of their multiple bulkheads. Inspired by the way bamboo grows in sections, this Chinese design gave their ships great strength.
In 1407, the eunuch Cheng He built huge boats in Changle to sail to the Western Ocean. The Ministry of War wanted Fujian province to build 100 of the fleet's ships. The next year, it ordered another 5 huge ones.
With the whole weight of the Ming state behind it, the scale of this enterprise was awesome. Carpenters, sailmakers, and blacksmiths were drafted in from across the country. Archaeologists have dug up evidence of the new technologies that were deployed. As with the Titanic, bulkheads divided the ships into watertight compartments. Outer hulls were triple planked for strength. Steered by that great Chinese invention, the stern rudder, as many as 9 masts carried the sails that propelled the great treasure junks.
All the ships of Zheng He's fleet were far superior to any of those of Columbus, Magellan, or da Gama.
The emperor planned a series of voyages to win tribute and allegiance from the rulers of the Indian Ocean. He issued seals of office to be presented to local rulers, binding them to his throne. Though some Confucian advisors opposed this venture, he could count on complete support from the court eunuchs. His most trusted eunuch, Zheng He, began assembling the expedition on the broad Yangtze River.
Zheng He arranged his fleet so that the command boats could communicate with the rest of the ships ranged up the Yangtze River.
With a skeleton crew, Zheng He sailed downriver to Taikang, a good place to recruit sailors.
It's a good harbor. The sailors are experienced. They grew up in this river country.
A stele, or inscribed stone tablet, gives the departure dates of the 7 voyages.
The stele records destinations as well as dates of arrival and departure. It states clearly that Zheng He was first to embark from the port of Taichung.
Zheng He recruited key members of his crew from the communities of Muslim Arab seafarers in Fujian province. Arabs had been drawn here by trade. Centuries later, Chinese Muslims still live here, worship in mosques, and recall the day the admiral, a fellow Muslim, stopped in their town.
There was a huge storm that day. When Zheng He came ashore to our town, our ancestors went to meet him at a pavilion on the edge of town. They chatted and played chess as if they were old friends. He stayed in our village for 2 days. But I don't know the details.
No. It was to recruit sailors and specialists for his fleet. The journey sounded too dangerous. But he convinced us over a game of chess.
He was particularly keen to recruit Arabs.
他在这个东风跟西风的交流中间，阿拉伯是起了一个。
Arabs had a great experience in navigation. They had always played a big role in links between East and West.
The tomb of one of the men Zheng He played chess with is still here. At the time of his visit, there were reported to be over 10,000 Arabs living and trading in the great ports of southern China. In the fall of 1421, Zheng He was ready to embark on the 6th of his 7 great voyages. All he needed now was a fair wind.
His fleet needed a north wind. This began in November. Zheng He still went to the mountain where the fishermen pray for favorable winds. And he too prayed to the goddess of the sea for safety. His men believed in the goddess, and the ceremony was quite a serious affair. They asked for her protection. They feared they would run into danger.
Late November 1421, the winds veered at last, and Admiral Zheng He ordered his great fleet to weigh anchor.
There were between 100 and 200 ships, including 7 great boats for the commanders, boats for horses, people, water, and food.
Personnel, about 30,000, the majority of which were military people.
An eyewitness account said they needed 200 to 300 men just to operate the rudder, sails, and anchors.
Zheng He's fleet would have dwarfed the combined fleets of Europe at the time.
We have set out for the barbarian countries, commanding the multitudes on the fleet. Our one fear is not to succeed. But if all men serve their emperor, then we will succeed.
They were a strange mixture of superstition and science, but they used technology that's still in use today, a Chinese invention, the compass.
We entreat the patriarchs of the imperially created compass, and those through the ages who have traversed the sea and the great guardian spirits of the 24 directions. We beseech all to protect our ships.
Though sea logs and other records have been destroyed, one of Zheng He's maps has survived.
The charts were drawn for sailors. People assume they are upside down, without latitude and longitude. But the chart puts the actual course of the ship as they sail at the center. So north and south are rotating. The fleet left Taikan Harbor, following east, southeast, to reach the open sea. Even today, you could use this to sail to India and Africa.
Zheng He's surviving map is just one of the clues that make it possible to trace the journey he then took.
The journey on the sea was dangerous. At times, mist and cloud came, and you couldn't see nothing. Earth and heaven blended into one vast emptiness.
The fleet had its own embedded historian, Ma Huan, a translator who was to chronicle its voyages.
I followed the mission wherever it went, for I do not know how many thousands of miles. I passed through the various countries with their different seasons, climates, topography, and peoples. I am incapable of literary elegances. I write of these matters with an honest pen, and nothing more.
Ma Huan's account tells us that the fleet sailed down the coast of Vietnam, past Thailand, and on to Malacca in Malaysia, just north of modern Singapore.
Steer 120 degrees by 135. The ship is level with Malacca.
After 3 weeks at sea, Zheng He's fleet arrived at Malacca. Malacca is the gateway to the Indian Ocean and a perfect place to build a supply base for the fleet.
When the treasure ships arrived here, they at once erected a stockade. Inside again, they erected a second stockade, like a small city wall within which they constructed warehouses and granaries.
The Chinese needed a depot. They're a long way from home. They also wanted to control the Straits of Malacca. When you control the straits, you control trade. And this was the other aspect of the Ming Emperor's aspirations. Not only the economic domination, he had to politically dominate.
When the base was threatened by local skirmishes, they backed a local rebel leader, turning him into a puppet king.
The rise of Malacca is intimately tied to support from the Ming. And it was through that support that Malacca came to be one of the great trade ports of the 15th century.
The emperor's official seal confirmed this pact.
The King of Malacca also have this type of seal given by the Emperor of China.
The locals have a more romantic version of this story. Legend tells of a fairy tale marriage that united the Chinese and Malays in friendship.
The Chinese princess and her many handmaidens were brought to our country as a gift to our great king. So pleased was he with her beauty that he gave the great hill of Malacca on which her kinsman might settle.
Today, the hill still serves the Chinese community as a graveyard. The cantonment, or Chinese enclave, which grew up around the fleet's supply base, is still there. Malacca remains today a city shaped by that Chinese contact. And a new statue of Zheng He waits to look down on the town he helped to found.
They marshaled the goods, then they waited till the wind was favorable. In the middle decade of the 5th moon, they put to sea.
Now, for the first time, they struck out into the open sea across the Indian Ocean. At Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, they left an inscribed stone stele to record their passing. It does not record their first armed confrontation. For though Zheng He's main purpose was peaceful power projection, he was willing to use force where necessary.
The fleet was threatened by the king of Ceylon. Zheng He was ready to take the island by force.
When you look at the violence which occurred during these voyages, one has to look a bit beyond the rhetoric. That these were less than friendly missions, that there was a huge amount of intimidation involved. When you take 30,000 troops, it's not intended to be a mission of peace and friendship.
The king was taken like an animal in a cage, shivering, begging for his life.
We have a preeminent global power. The Ming in the 15th century, their missions were both a political and an economic attempt to dominate the known world.
The junk sailed on, their holds crammed with the produce of China's massive porcelain and silk industries, keen to gain direct access to the marketplaces of the Indian Ocean. The fleet's own chronicler, Ma Huan, describes how it sailed on to India's Malabar coast and the city of Calicut.
It lies beside the sea, the country of Calicut. This is a great country of the Western Ocean.
The Malabar coast was the fulcrum of the Indian Ocean trade network.
If a treasure ship goes there, it is left entirely to two men to superintend the buying and sailing. A local broker comes and joins them.
When the fleet came, the ship was approached by the local people in small boats. The middlemen, people who were acting as brokers for the collection of goods, and they were translators as well.
They discuss the price of the silks one by one. When the price has been fixed, they write out an agreement. All join hands together, and the broker then says, in such and such a moon, on such and such a day, we have all joined hands and sealed our agreement with a hand clasp. Whether the price be dear or cheap, we will never repudiate it.
Today, little has changed. The Chinese traded their silks and porcelain for spices, which were brought to Cochin and stocked in warehouses. These days, tally sticks coexist with computers. Over the centuries, the spice trade has brought great wealth to Calicut. You can see it to this day in the ornaments that adorn the elephants during temple festivals. Some of that gold may well have come from the ancient trade with China.
There was an old saying, if the China is the place where you make money, Cochin is the place where you spend it. There was an old saying like that. So most of the spices was taken from Cochin, and they were in return given gold. You can see the ornaments on the top of elephants. The way of income for the Cochin kingdom was through spice trade, because there was no gold in India.
The Chinese chronicler Ma Huan was struck by how much the two great civilizations had in common.
Here we have engraved a stone, a perpetual declaration for 10,000 ages. He says that a journey from this country to China is more than 100,000 li, yet the people are very similar, happy and prosperous, and with identical customs.
Local dance theater owes much to its contact with the Chinese.
Very many art forms of coastal India, very clear kind of influence of the Chinese. Chinese opera influencing the local art forms. Various dance drama performances are straightaway replicas of Chinese opera.
The story of tonight's play is that of the Monkey King, a mythical character who is common to Indians and Chinese. The Starfleet had already sailed an incredible 6,000 miles. It was now ready for the next leg of its journey. As we followed this journey, it's surprising how much of our modern world would still be familiar to Zheng He's sailors. 600 years ago, Asian seafarers were enormously skilled and knowledgeable. Zheng He did not need to venture into a complete unknown. His navigators did exactly what merchants do to this day. They hired local pilots to set the course from India's Malabar coast to the fabled lands of Arabia.
The local traders who were traveling in fairly big vessels had better know-how, so definitely such people's help was essential. And certainly people who were coming to the coast for the first time must have been guided by them.
They would have been picking up pilots there, either Arab or Indian pilots, to come across, because there was a lively trade going on. You'd find the info from the local knowledge from the pilots that would be available there, from the captains that had sailed over, perhaps were waiting to come back to Arabia themselves. So you would ask around, you'd get, they know when to leave, they know when they'd be coming here. The knowledge would be freely available.
The Ming fleet weighed anchor and sailed away from the coast of India. The Chinese could certainly use some local knowledge. Their own methods for predicting wind and weather were, to say the least, idiosyncratic. Fortunately for them, help was at hand. Then, as now, Indian pilots knew all about the seasonal monsoon winds, which is so crucial in this part of the world.
During the monsoon season, vessels mainly depending on sails can start from Arabia and come to India with least effort. If you try to go in the opposite direction, you will be wasting your time in the sea.
The journey from India to Arabia would have been timed to coincide with the second half of the monsoon season, when the winds reversed direction.
The winds which were blowing from southwest to northeast will blow in the exactly opposite direction. From northeast, they will blow to southwest.
That's why Indian spice traders always timed their journeys to coincide with the phases of the monsoon. Chinese scholars who have studied the fleet's surviving charts say that Chinese navigation was more sophisticated than their techniques for predicting wind and weather.
We still have 4 original charts from Zheng He's voyages for crossing the Indian Ocean. We use the sun by day. We use the stars at night. We use the height of the star to determine the position of the ship, its latitude. Going from Calicut to Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, they used many stars, but the main one was the pole star.
Chinese navigators also tapped into the knowledge of the Arabs, the greatest astronomers of the period.
If you look at the stars, we know how they found their positioning in the sea. They used a kamal, a square board, lined up the bottom edge with the horizon and the top edge with a pole star. From that, they could calculate their latitude. The Arabs were the great navigators. They were the prime link throughout the Indian Ocean. Two examples. The compass came from us to them and then to Europe. The kamal is an Arab invention, but we adapted it to suit us.
The Chinese and the Arabs both used the same techniques to navigate by the stars. And after 4 centuries of trade between these two great civilizations, it has become difficult to decide who learned what from whom.
The Arabs had sets of navigation, well, some of them were poems, some of us just really pilot books, where they could tell the prospective navigators, okay, on a certain day you leave this port if you want to go to another port. And it would also tell how to get from one port to another.
This Arab pilot book was written in rhyme to help sailors remember which stars would guide them to which ports.
It speaks about the direction, the area where we are, the exact ports and stars positioning. Okay. Also, you could follow what for them was the mouth of the lion, which is part of a scorpion. It's kind of a collection of stars together, and if you follow the timings right, then you reach exactly on that direction.
Blown by the northeast monsoon, the Starfleet entered the Straits of Hormuz, the very hub of Arabian trade routes. Years earlier, the ancient Silk Road across the landmass of Asia had been cut by Mongol conquests. The Chinese were keen to re-engage with the Arab world and reconnect with a network of caravan routes that crisscrossed the Middle East and terminated at the trading towns that lined the Persian Gulf. The fleet at anchor became a vast emporium, exchanging silk and porcelain for the luxuries carried here to the marketplaces of Hormuz, Kalhat, and Sohar.
Sohar, for instance, was described in the 15th century to be the most active trading port city in the whole of the East. And that made it easier for China to bring their goods into Sohar and take others from all over. Items that were traded in Sohar came all the way from Europe and also all the way from the various parts of Africa.
Tom Vosmer has been excavating another of these ports, Kalhat in Oman.
This being Chinese, probably 15th century.
The foreshore is littered with evidence of Chinese visits to the Persian Gulf. 600 years ago, this port would have been swarming with camel caravans and foreign merchants.
More Chinese Celadon. We'd probably have these coming across from Hormuz because the Chinese were landing a lot of their goods at Hormuz, and we have a real good connection with Hormuz here. They would have anchored down in here. There's a bay there. We found a lot of stone anchors there that date to this same period. So that sort of confirms in our minds that this was the port area.
Chinese learned this was a good place to buy horses. The loss of the Silk Road had cut China off from Central Asia at the very time when threats from beyond the Great Wall left China in urgent need of new mounts for its cavalry.
At that time, horses were fetching about 100 pieces of silver, and our historian has discovered that a male slave was only 5. So a horse was fabulously valuable here, and the people were making a lot of money from that sort of thing.
The Chinese were open to the learning of Arab scientists, who back then were the most knowledgeable in the world. The Chinese had recently suffered outbreaks of plague, and medicine was high on their list of priorities. Zheng He had recruited over 100 Chinese doctors and pharmacologists to seek out new medicines. Arabia is still a cornucopia of medicinal herbs and countless other remedies.
هذا من جبل الأخضر من وادي مستل من وادي مستل من وادي الطايين المكان هذا وهذا يستخدم عن وجع البطن عن وجع القلب عن وجع كل شيء سوى فيه.
This is sa'tar. As he said, it came from Jabal al-Akhdar, and it used for the stomach ache and for the heart, and you can take this with the sugar and mix with the hot water and take it like a tea, and it is good for the stomach.
Frankincense, myrrh, cinnabar, and storax were processed, dried, and packed away in jars for their eventual return journey. There was one more piece of invaluable information that the Chinese could learn from the Arabs, for it was they who held the key to Africa. The Chinese had long known of the Dark Continent, and centuries earlier, Chinese goods had reached these shores on Arab sailing boats. The stated aim of this, the 6th voyage, was to return ambassadors from African cities who had previously journeyed to China. But the fascination with Africa ran much deeper. Arab vessels had traded slaves and gold for centuries. But by the time the Ming fleet arrived, the stage was set for a different kind of exchange. Far from being primitive societies, there were African nations that had traded their way to great wealth, and stone-built cities lined the coast.
A town like Pati at this time has about 9 gates, huge buildings, palaces, and we have huge mosques. These towns are now showing some kind of prestige that they have achieved this much wealth, they have achieved this much power. They now have to symbolically also show that they are important.
For African rulers, blue and white Ming porcelain, delicate and exotic, became the ultimate status symbol.
In these round niches, they used to put the porcelain bowls, which would look like this. And the bowls were meant for decoration purposes, right? This bowl is a 15th century Chinese bowl. The people around here had a psychological feeling that the shards of these particular bowls, once they are taken and kept in the suitcases, the people will become rich or wealthy. So a good number of them were taken for such a purpose.
treacherous shoals on the African coastline took their toll on Chinese trading vessels.
This is nice.
There's even a special word for those who were shipwrecked here. They're known as the Famau. Off the coast of Kenya, there's an island where it is said that descendants of some of these Chinese castaways can still be found. Their stories have been passed down through the village's own keeper of tales.
She's one of the Chinese family is nearby, and Mansuri, he can take us there. He knows the family.
The Farooq household was one of the 4 Famau families on the island. Bibi Farooq believes her shipwrecked ancestor came from China.
They had a shipwreck, and they came, that was in Shanga, and then they came to Siu, and then they got married to the locals. And even the name of her mother is called Safina, meaning it's a dhow which saved these people from the shipwreck to bring them to the seashore. And now they are the descendants of those Chinese people who had a shipwreck.
Ndivyo hivyo. Basi vile mezezi kidogo kinaeleza. Basi vile amekuwa huko mvundikiwa wakawa ni wenye kutembea tu. Sasa kwa hivyo ni waume lazima watakuwa wana hamu na wenye muhimu pia mpaka wafahamu
Therefore they had it about it from the parents, and it's the story of the town. Everyone knows in the village about the shipwreck.
But what incentive led the Ming fleet to brave the risks of a 10,000-mile ocean voyage to Africa?
Came to bring tortoiseshell back to China, which they would use for a variety of things. Rhino horns, like these horns from black rhinos, would be brought back to China, and they were mostly used for the making of medicines to lower fever. They prefer the bigger...
Esmond Martin has dedicated much of his life to stamping out the now illegal trade that brought the Chinese to Kenya.
And this would be bigger than the average tusk that you would find in Asia. And this is soft ivory as well, is a distinction. The forest elephants of Asia produce a hard ivory, which is more difficult to carve. And the Chinese have always liked soft ivory, so this African ivory that they would get from East Africa was superior.
5 centuries ago, the trade in tusks would have dwarfed the stacked seas from modern poachers in the fight to save Africa's wildlife. But the Chinese motives were mixed. While some filled the holds of their treasure ships with ivory and rhinoceros horn, others were searching out new and wonderful animals for the emperor's menagerie. What lured the Ming Starfleet to Africa may have been a hunger for the exotic, and Africa had much to offer. A contemporary illustrator recorded a host of fantastic beasts: the rhinoceros, the ostrich, and the zebra. Their 16th century illustrated book of strange countries records their wonder. And here on the savannas, they came across the greatest prize of all, an animal so strange, so unusual, that it seemed to fit the description of the legendary qilin, the Chinese equivalent of the unicorn. Arrangements were made to bring it back to confer good fortune on the emperor himself.
But they actually did it, to me, is mind-boggling. And then getting it onto the boat, have no idea how they did that. Keeping it in a boat for all those months in storms, it must have been a feat.
You know, she has a weird balance, these spindly legs and that heavy body. You know, you may have noticed when a giraffe gallops, they kind of pull forwards and they get this rocking motion. If something puts that rocking out, they'll go over head over heels. And so maybe on a boat that would also be a bit of a problem.
History does not record how they transported their living treasure across 8,000 miles of sea. But 3 months later, the imperial palace was mesmerized by the sight of the giraffe.
Court officials, craning their necks, looked on with pleasure and stamping their feet when they were scared or startled, thinking that these were things that were rarely heard of in the world and that China had never seen their likeness.
The giraffe had come from the ends of the earth to be recorded in the meticulous records of the Forbidden City. The achievements of Zheng He and the Starfleet rank as some of the greatest in naval history. But for centuries, this story has been largely confined to China, unknown to and unrecognized by the rest of the world. In the next hour, this program will examine the astonishing claim that Chinese sailors went beyond the edge of the known world, crossed the Atlantic, discovered America, and became the first to circumnavigate the globe. In the year 1405, China's Ming Emperor had assembled the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. With more than 300 junks, some of them the biggest wooden ships ever built, and a combined crew of 28,000, the mighty Starfleet was to embark on 7 epic voyages. The historical record shows that under the supreme command of a Muslim eunuch called Zheng He, the fleet expanded China's known world to Malacca, Sumatra, Java, Sri Lanka, India, Arabia, Africa, perhaps even Australia. But after 30 years of extraordinary achievement, there was a dramatic reversal of policy. Jealous Confucian courtiers forced the empire to abandon its forward naval policy. Zheng He was forgotten, his fleet laid up, and many of his maps, logs, and records destroyed. This historical vacuum has fueled ideas that there might be a missing chapter in the story of the Ming fleet. Gavin Menzies, a former submarine commander of Britain's Royal Navy, has spent 15 years poring over maps and documents of the period. Now, in a theory that defies academic opinion, he claims that on its 6th voyage, Zheng He's fleet sailed beyond its home waters to cross the Atlantic Ocean. If he's correct, the Chinese could have discovered the Americas 70 years before Christopher Columbus.
When the first European explorers set forth for the New World, every single one of the great names had a map showing in them the way to go. Not one of the great European explorers discovered anything new. Somebody discovered the world before Europeans did.
This program will examine how the Chinese may have crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape, and sailed on into the South Atlantic. Then, with the input of 220 scholars, including 30 from China, Gavin Menzies' theory that the Chinese discovered America before Columbus will be put to the test. Menzies' new theory of history starts in the year 1421 in the bustling Indian port of Calicut. We know that having already sailed some 6,000 miles, the great Chinese fleet was lying at anchor here, because Ma Huan, the expedition's chronicler, has left us detailed descriptions of Calicut's booming spice trade.
The inhabitants of this mountainous countryside have established spice gardens. When the period of the 10th moon arrives, the pepper ripens. It is collected, dry in the sun, then they wait for foreign merchants to come to buy.
Ma Huan was not the only foreigner to visit Calicut at about this time.
In these districts, they grow ginger, called in the language of the country, beledi, or gebeli, or neli.
Niccolo de Conti, an Italian merchant adventurer who spent 25 years living and traveling in the East, also describes the bustle of the Calicut spice trade. De Conti's account of how they dried ginger 600 years ago reads as if it was written yesterday.
The ginger is obtained from the root of a shrub. They cast ashes upon it and place it in the tropical sun for 3 days, by which time it is dried.
De Conti's story of his time in the Indian port of Calicut is important to Gavin Menzies' theory. Menzies believes that de Conti not only saw the Ming fleet, but that he met the Chinese admiral. Menzies points to a statue of Zheng He and his admirals, recently found in China. It includes the figure of what may be a mysterious foreigner, who Menzies takes to be de Conti. According to Menzies, Niccolo de Conti sailed with the Chinese fleet for 3 years and ultimately returned with it to China. In China, de Conti was able to collect maps of the fleet's epic voyage.
Niccolo de Conti boards the Chinese fleet. Now, he then is with the fleet in about the year 1420, which crossed the Indian Ocean non-stop and rounded the Cape of Good Hope.
Niccolo de Conti returned to Venice. At that time, Venice was glorious and self-confident, the most important maritime state in the Mediterranean. It was also the terminus for the trade routes that led east into the Arab world and beyond. Here, de Conti could well have come into contact with Fra Mauro, a monk skilled in map-making and based in a monastery in the city. Fra Mauro made a point of questioning merchants like de Conti, who passed through the city and provided him with a steady diet of travelers' tales and hard geographical information brought from beyond the margins of the known world. Fra Mauro had received a commission from the King of Portugal to construct a definitive map of the then known world. The timing of de Conti's return to Venice was perfect.
Fra Mauro says he got his information from a merchant of good standing. And I'd say that's Niccolo da Conti.
Fra Mauro's map is still in Venice, and for the last 10 years, Professor Piero Falchetta has been its custodian.
Well, this is the map. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And the Mediterranean Sea is upside down because the map is upside down. This is Africa, so that's the bottom of Africa. And there is a very interesting inscription saying that around 1420, an Oriental junk coming possibly from China navigated through the Indian Ocean towards the islands of Man and Women, offshore of the Cape of Diab, in between the Green Island and the darkness, for 40 days.
Gavin Menzies has no doubt what the Green Island means.
Pramara then says that a ship or junk from India reached the Islas Verdes. Well, 40 days and 4.8 knots, which is the average speed of the Chinese fleet, would have taken them to the Cape Verde Islands. So I say Islas Verdes equals Cape Verde Islands.
According to Fra Mauro, an Oriental ship sailed out for 40 days and came back. That might mean some ships of the fleet did indeed sail past the Cape of Good Hope. The English scholar Professor Needham supported this view, as have some Chinese scholars. Now, Gavin Menzies have drawn much wider-reaching conclusions. Zheng He's fleet would have had no problem crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Look at the tiny ships used by da Gama and Columbus. If they had seen our ships, they would have been astonished.
Menzies is convinced that the Venetian map shows the Ming fleet could have entered the Atlantic, and if it did, nature now lends it a hand.
Coming round the Cape of Good Hope, on this Admiralty chart, these blue currents, you can see carrying the ship up the west coast of Africa. Then he would be pushed inland by the winds, carried up by the current, then in a strong current to the west, then trade winds push him into the coast once again, until he gets up north of the Cape Verde Islands when the currents push him down. Then, leaving the Cape Verde Islands, he's carried in a massive volume of water, absolutely due west. A sailor near the coast of Africa, if he did absolutely nothing, he just hoisted his sails, he would get carried by the wind and the current across the North Atlantic and would enter the Caribbean between Dominica and Guadeloupe. Hundreds and hundreds of explorers have entered the Caribbean in this way.
Menzies now tries to pick up the trail in the French Caribbean.
Captain, quel cap maintenant, s'il vous plaît?
Le 315.
D'accord. So we're steering 315, coming in, running in from the Atlantic, exactly as the Chinese sailed.
Menzies believes this map, drawn in 1424, is a breakthrough for his theory. Known as the Pizzigano chart, it seems to show islands across the Atlantic 3/4 of a century before Columbus ever sailed there. Menzies believes only the Chinese could have charted the islands, which he believes he can identify.
The person who drew the 1424 Pizzigano chart drew Les Saintes exactly as he would have seen them from sea level, more or less this time of the day. On the Pizzigano chart, he's drawn this red island, and he's drawn 3 bays. And that's exactly what you can see. There's the first bay, the second bay, with the tall mountain in the back, and there's the third bay there. Couldn't have been drawn better. We're now exactly in the channel opposite the middle of the 3 bays.
The original map was drawn by Zwayne Pizzigano, who belonged to a family of famous map makers. Today it's kept in the James Ford Bell Library in Minnesota. Its former curator is Carol Ernest.
Of latitude. What we have seen here is a shift to the west. It represents a change from the enclosed Mediterranean to this open ocean, like a highway to the west. And we see for the first time the island of Antillia and some of these other islands. This is 1424, a long time ago. Now there are people, for very good reasons, who feel these are legendary islands. However, I believe the islands are real. Now Gavin has come up with, a new theory about this. He was working from the names, he was working from the shape of the island, and I think he's got a very good case.
Menzies has studied the words on the old chart. Two of them, Khan and Umana, seem to indicate a volcano and an eruption.
We're now looking at Guadalupe there. If you compare Pizzigano's chart with what's there today, here in yellow is what was drawn on the 1424 chart, Con Imana, that means volcano erupts there. And on the modern chart, where Pizzigano has drawn it in exactly the same position, there are two volcanoes, Soufriere and L'Echelle. In fact, the Smithsonian have told me that they erupted twice between 1400 and 1440, when Pizzigano said they did. The island shown on the 1424 chart is in fact Guadalupe. The volcanoes, the streams, the bays, ties up absolutely with the 1424 chart. And there it is, all laid out in front of you.
By now, Menzies believes the fleet had divided itself. One half sailed south, the other, under an admiral called Zhu Wen, sailed north.
We carried through the Caribbean, northeast past Dominican Haiti, northeast past Cuba, up past Andros and Bimini.
Following Admiral Zhu Wen's presumed course, Menzies flies north to the island of Bimini. Coming into land, you can see one of the so-called shark mounds, a strange fish-like feature. Menzies believes these mounds contain the wrecks of Chinese junks, because he's convinced that in Bimini the Ming fleet was struck by a hurricane. We too were caught in the middle of a tropical storm as we approached the reef.
Rounded the top of Bimini, and they're in a terrible bad way. They've had their bottoms ripped out as they cross the coral reef. Seven of the great junks were deposited on what was then a sandbank. They've been covered by sand, and they're now called the shark mounds. 500 foot long, the same length as the great junks. They are the graves of ships. The Chinese fleet got carried by the hurricane and dumped where we are now. He had a smashed fleet. He had to repair his ships, and he had to get his men off. The ships that were all right, he had to get them off this island. This is the sort of weather he had all those years ago, the poor devil. Another 100 knots of wind. The night down there, Doug, is it reasonably clear?
After the eye of the storm had passed, Menzies took us to the curious underwater rock formation known round the world as the Bimini Road. Menzies believes this is a slipway built by the Chinese to refit the fleet and repair the damage caused by the hurricane.
They used the beach rock and the ship's ballast to construct a slipway between here and the shore. When they got really close in, they ran out of beach rock, so they used the hull stones from the hull for the last 250 yards. Basically, this whole road is about 1,200 feet long. It's a giant slipway. for hauling these junks ashore. We swim down, we can see the stones stretching away to the land, exactly as one would expect a slipway to look. Some very sophisticated civilization built the roads before Europeans arrived. I say it's the Chinese.
Seaworthy once more, according to Menzies, the fleet was ready to weigh anchor.
The Chinese, when they left Bimini, they could only go in one direction, that's northwards. That is the way that the winds and the currents would have carried them to Florida.
And so in the year 1421, some 70 years before Columbus, if Menzies is right, the Chinese may at last have made landfall on the continent of America. He cites as evidence a research paper co-authored by 11 geneticists, one of whom was Gabriel Novick's. The paper says that Native American DNA is closer to Chinese than European or African DNA, and that this genetic mixing could have happened 10 or 12,000 years ago, when people migrated across the Bering Straits, which is a fairly recent occurrence in DNA terms.
Now, this is Professor Novick's research. The close similarity between the Chinese and the Native Americans suggests recent gene flow formation. All of the places where Chinese DNA has been found by Novick, European explorers found Chinese people. Giovanni da Verrazzano, the first European to reach what is now New York, he says he met Chinese people. Simple as that.
In some ways, they are alike to the people of the East, and especially to them of the outermost parts of China.
Everywhere that Professor Novick says that Indian peoples of the Americas have similar DNA to the Chinese is where I say in my book that the Chinese settled. 100% of the places I say they settled, we've got DNA evidence. Just unnerving.
Menzies believes there are other clues that the Chinese reached America. He's convinced they built observatories along the route they sailed. The Chinese had a centuries-long tradition of astronomy and astral navigation. But there was a limit to how much the science of the stars can be studied from a heaving deck at sea, hence the observatories. Menzies has identified a possible 28 around the world. He believes the Newport Tower on Rhode Island is one of them.
Can you see through both of the windows?
Yeah,
be good. Yeah, let me do a shot of it. Can you hold? Let me get right up in front of the astrolabe.
The exact date and purpose of this tower are disputed. Over the years, it may have served multiple uses.
Tower, anyway. You want to double check it?
Professor Bill Penhallow has spent years studying the tower. He was happy to test Menzies' theory that the tower could have been used to solve the greatest puzzle of medieval astronomers: longitude.
So the line at the top is true north and south, and we have our plumb bob down like so, and so those two lines define a local meridian.
Menzies argues that if one observer in Beijing and another here at the tower were to record which star was directly overhead at a precise moment, they could work out how far they were from each other and thus calculate longitude. The tower might perhaps have served a dual function. Menzies agrees with Bob Hassel's theory that the tower could have doubled as a lighthouse.
Very interesting. Why would you build a fireplace 12 feet above the ground? You know, this is something that doesn't make a lot of sense until you look at the fireplace out that window and it's in direct line with where you would want to turn in the harbor to make a port entry into Newport.
Right.
This is fascinating from a mariner's point of view. The tower is located right at this point here.
The fireplace and the window were a particular angle. What was that angle?
That angle has been measured. It's 264.5 degrees, right, down to this point.
The string gives the line of sight from the tower window out into the harbor.
Okay, so if you're coming into port from the ocean,
coming up here,
he would be able to see the tower, would see the light, and the light would be coming through this window,
right,
would be visible in the channel. Then he's in a safe port, out of the tide, out of the wind.
Though this program concentrates on the question of whether the Chinese discovered America, Menzies believes the Ming fleet also reached South America, Australia, New Zealand, the Arctic, and Antarctica. This is why he believes the claim in one document that the fleet visited 3,000 countries is quite literally true.
This Ming transcription records an amazing 3,000 countries visited.
If Menzies is right, history will have to be rewritten. And China's mighty Ming fleet will take the place of Columbus in the Age of Discovery. So were the Chinese the first to reach America? Let us return to the Indian port of Calicut and the beginning of Gavin Menzies' revolutionary theory. There's no doubt that de Conti was here. His vivid account of the bustling trading ports of Malabar and the minute detail of the pepper and ginger trade are evidence enough. De Conti also provides a graphic eyewitness description of what may well have been Chinese ships.
They built some ships much larger than ours, with 4 sails and as many masts. The lower part is constructed with triple planks to withstand the force of the tempests. Some ships are so built in compartments that should one part be shattered, the other portion may still accomplish the voyage.
De Conti's account of his travels are an important feature of Menzies' book.
Niccolo da Conti met the Chinese fleet at Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. He traveled with them via Africa to Australia to end up in China. And he brought the information back with him to Venice.
So could Niccolo de Conti have been the source of these Chinese secrets? Did he actually meet the fleet? What does Niccolo de Conti's own account say?
We have his text, and there is nothing in his text, nothing. He speaks, he writes about India, about China, but he never mentioned Chinese fleets, Chinese navigators, or something like that. Never, never, never.
Piero Falchetta is a scholar who is critical of Gavin Menzies' theory. How does Menzies respond to his critics? Menzies agreed to sit with the producers of this program and review a number of points. We started by asking him about the evidence that de Conti had actually met and sailed with the Ming fleet.
Well, this is a photograph of a statue found in the Fujian province of China, and it was found when the workmen were extending the runway in Fujian. Now, the interesting thing about this statue is that the man has a bulbous nose and he has very large ears. He's clearly not Chinese, he's not Far Eastern. To Chinese, he appears European. So it is at least arguable that it's Niccolo da Conti.
Arguable, but not certain?
No, not at all. Now, I say that it's unarguable that he arrived in Calicut when the Chinese fleet was coming through.
In the case, why does he not concretely say he saw the Great Fleet?
I agree with you. That's one of the weakest parts of my story.
Is there any evidence that he boarded a ship in the Ming fleet?
Da Conti, not that I know of, no.
The scene shifts to Venice. Though Niccolo de Conti does not expressly mention a Chinese fleet, Menzies believes that de Conti sailed round the world with it before returning to his native city, carrying the maps and secrets of the Chinese with him. De Conti may then have passed on this information to the mapmaker Fra Mauro, who used it to draw his great world map, now in the library in Venice. Menzies believes that map contains an important clue. It shows an Oriental ship that rounds a great cape and sails into unknown seas. Dr. Piero Falchetta quotes a note written by the mapmaker.
Finding nothing but water and air. And they navigated for 2,000 miles. This expedition didn't reach any land. This is absolutely clear from this witness, from our map. So we cannot say that a fleet went to America on the base of this inscription.
Shows the ship.
The map only depicts a single vessel.
I think his wording was a ship or junk from India. He didn't say an Indian ship. He said a ship or junk.
So it could have sailed from India.
Absolutely, that's what he claimed.
But it's a single ship rather than a great fleet.
It is. I accept that.
A fleet. No. In Fra Mauro there is nothing we can presume about a fleet navigating in the Indian Ocean. He says one ship, one junk. There is nothing explicit about a fleet navigating there.
But according to Menzies' theory, the fleet entered the Atlantic, skirted the African coast, and then rode the same winds that Columbus later did to the Caribbean.
There it is, right ahead. The mariner will be carried by the wind and the current due west. He will enter between, exactly where we are now, between Guadeloupe and Dominica. As you can see right there, Soufriere and L'Echelle.
Menzies believes that the Atlantic chart drawn in 1424 was based on information from the Chinese. According to Menzies, Satanazes, the blue island, is Guadeloupe, and the red island named Antigua is Puerto Rico. Professor Carol Ernest, who has studied the 1424 map, is impressed by Menzies' identification, but she sees some problems.
The idea that this information comes from a Chinese voyage is a little tricky, a little difficult, because we don't have the Chinese map. The names on the islands are not Chinese.
Menzies acknowledges some problems with the map.
They're not drawn correctly relative to each other, and I can only assume that the cartographer, Pizzigano, who took them off, and what I say is the Chinese chart, quite simply made a mistake. He transposed them wrongly.
Luciano da Silva, a Portuguese museum curator, has researched the old chart and compared it to the maps in Menzies' book.
Now, let's take a look. The island of Antigua appears on the nautical chart of 1424 in red and in the vertical position. Mr. Menzies, what does he do? He turns that island that is in a vertical position, he turns it horizontally in order to compare it with Puerto Rico. You should never do a thing like that. You cannot alter anything that appears on the original map. The original map says that the island of Antigua is vertical. You should make a comparison only with vertical, not with horizontal position. So this is a no-no. Mr. Menzies, what does he do further? The island of Satanás that appears in blue and with all these deep bays with inclination towards Europe, Mr. Menzies turns the island upside down.
This is a modern nautical chart, and it has the features of the nautical chart. And this, in Gavin Menzies' view, is Antigua, Puerto Rico, and this is Santanzas, or Guadalupe, in the modern map.
The islands on the old map appeared to have swapped positions.
Yeah, there's a flip. I don't want to get into this. There's a flip. They're turned to, and I just
So I see. Sorry, that's a confusion.
Yeah, there's some confusion, yeah.
Menzies believes there is other compelling evidence that enables him to identify the mysterious island. The words Khan and Umana appear on the map. Menzies says these are medieval Portuguese words which he translates as volcano erupts here. And since there was a volcanic eruption in Guadeloupe about 600 years ago, he argues that the Blue Island must be Guadeloupe. We showed Gavin Menzies an email from an eminent Portuguese medieval linguist who says the translation of Khan and Umana is wrong.
Well, all I can say is that Professor Camilo dos Santos doesn't agree with what's in that email. Professor Camilo dos Santos said that it meant volcano erupts here, question mark.
Santos actually said, you know, I'm not an expert in a linguistic expert. I'm a professor of literature and you should check with other people.
Well, he's a professor of medieval literature.
What about the specialists in medieval Portuguese who say it can't mean that?
I'm afraid I can't arbitrate.
Professor dos Santos says he cannot translate Khan and Umana because he specializes in modern Portuguese literature. He told us to talk instead to Professor da Costa, who is an expert in medieval Portuguese.
These two words exist, in fact, in current Portuguese. Con means cone, so can be the shape of a volcano. It's possible. But these words were not used with this sense in the 15th century. They are used later, just later. And for sure, I never read such words, neither one nor the other, in Portuguese chronicles of the 15th or the 16th century or in documentation. That's not the way to speak about volcanoes. And I don't think so, just because the words were not used in Portuguese of those times.
If the fleet ever did reach Guadeloupe, wind and tide would have continued to push it north. Menzies believes that as the fleet approached Bimini, they encountered a hurricane, and that several junks were wrecked on the island. To repair their ships, says Menzies, the Chinese built a stone slipway, which he identifies as that curious underwater feature known as the Bimini Road.
Okay.
John Gifford, a professor of marine geology and archaeology, was commissioned by National Geographic to investigate the mystery of the Bimini Road. According to one theory, these symmetrically shaped stone blocks were the remains of an ancient city, possibly Atlantis.
I have to admit, the first time I dove on this in early 1970, I thought myself that it looked very definitely artificial. If it was Atlantis, actually, it would have been, in many ways, much more interesting. We looked very hard specifically for archaeological evidence. We found no archaeological evidence whatsoever. We found lots and lots of evidence about the geological origin of these stones. And, you know, when you're faced with a large mound of evidence that points towards geological origin and a zero evidence that points towards the archaeology, there's not much you can do about it. In my opinion, they're made by nature. They, in fact, represent a beach rock deposit, technically what's called a paleo shoreline.
There are various artifacts that have been found on the road which are man-made. There are man-made cement building blocks, a great number of them. And I say that they are to keep the ballast of the junks in position. They are exactly the right size for that. They're built in Chinese measurements. They're tongued and grooved. They fit into each other. Nobody can possibly argue that they're natural.
They're no longer there, and I can't study pieces of rock that may have come from China but are no longer there.
I don't budge a millimeter from my overall argument because a lot of the Bimini stones, more than 1,000 tons of them, were actually taken from Bimini into Florida, and they were used in the ship channel in Port Lauderdale, and they're still there today. You can go and have a look at them. And we have married up markings on those stones, which in my submission can only mean they were left by Chinese ships.
have any Chinese scholars authenticated these markings, show that they were Chinese, Ming-era Chinese stones?
No. A stonemason is trying to fathom out what they were. I accept that I haven't got Chinese experts' views on whether those markings are Chinese or not.
As you take off from Bimini, you can see the beach where Menzies says part of Jiao Wen's fleet was wrecked. You can also glimpse another of Bimini's unexplained phenomena, the shark mounds, shaped like a shark, or as Menzies believes, shaped like the hull of a Ming treasure ship washed 500 yards ashore in a hurricane 600 years ago. Menzies has been seeking permission to excavate the shark mounds, though a previous dig found no evidence of human activity.
If you look at one of the charts here of Bimini, you can see pretty clearly that there are long lineations here which really represent the accretionary growth of East Bimini. These are just like hundreds or thousands of other storm surge deposits that have been mapped all over the Bahamas.
Well, they're certainly storm surge deposits, but I say they're deposits covering wrecks.
But we've yet to probe them.
Absolutely.
So it's a possibility, but no proof.
Absolutely.
As Menzies approaches the American mainland, he knows that it only takes one piece of concrete evidence to confound his critics.
Steady out, steady out. There we go. Let's get windy.
We return to Newport, Rhode Island, and to the controversial Newport Tower. Menzies believes the Chinese built it to serve a dual purpose: half lighthouse, half observatory.
You have to have patience, and you have to have a night that's clear.
He thinks the Chinese used the tower to study the mysteries of the stars and solve the age-old problem of longitude.
Well,
Professor Penhallow has tested Menzies' theory that the tower could be used for longitude calculations, and he agrees it could, but Chinese written records contain no evidence of such advances.
China has no record of understanding longitude in the 14th and the 15th century. No, absolutely. Zheng He's voyages have no record of it.
I don't agree with that at all. I mean, if you look at the inventory of their observatories, they have everything in their observatories to enable them to calculate longitude.
Chinese scholar Mr. Zhu points out that Zheng He's own charts show no evidence of such a breakthrough.
The Chinese map that show longitude and latitude did not exist until Jesuit missionaries reached China with that knowledge 2 centuries later.
Some say the simplest explanation may lie in the local library. This is Benedict Arnold's will.
The date of Arnold's original will is 1677, and these are copies that were made in the 1750s. And right here, there's a line saying, "From my dwelling house leading to my stone-built windmill in the town of Newport aforementioned." This is a map of Newport made in 1776, showing the center of town. On the site, it says stone windmill.
Well, it could be a flour mill. You can knock any argument you want down. It is not any longer. My principal point, or key point, if I'm completely wrong, can I just go on for a minute? If I'm completely wrong on the Newport Tower, it doesn't really affect my argument anymore, because my argument now is that the first Europeans who got there, Giovanni da Verrazzano, found a Chinese settlement. That is my principal card now.
Giovanni da Verrazzano is one of a number of European explorers who, according to Menzies, encountered Chinese people when they landed in the New World. Verrazzano led an expedition which landed in what is now New York in the year 1524. There he encountered a band of Native Americans whose skin, he says, was russet in color, not unlike the Saracens. In other words, people from the Middle East. Gavin Menzies reads out the relevant passage.
So this is John de Verrazzano to the King of France. He says, "For we saw many of them not strong of body, yet sharp-witted, nimble, and exceeding great runners, as far as we could learn by experience. And in those two last qualities, they are like to the people of the east parts of the world, and especially to them of the uttermost parts of China."
So he's not saying they look Chinese, he's saying they run swiftly like people from that part of the world. But he doesn't actually say they're Chinese.
But he says they, in those aspects, they resemble the people of the uttermost parts of China.
Insofar as they're nimble and quick.
Menzies cites similar examples of eyewitness evidence, including Columbus.
Christopher Columbus.
Columbus, as you know, I think it's a very interesting point, because when he died, he believed he'd reached Cathay, China. And the reason he thought he had, in my view, is because he kept meeting Chinese people. I mean, he met Chinese people when he got to Cuba, off the coast of South America, Greenland, Ireland.
Isn't there a sort of circular logic there? Because he mistakenly thought he'd reached China, by definition, he'd think that the people were Chinese.
Well, with respect, I don't agree. I think that the fact that he kept meeting Chinese people led him to believe he was in China.
Menzies believes there is more than the accounts of Verrazzano and Columbus to show the Chinese got there first. And he says DNA science supports him. Native Americans do have some Asiatic genes. According to Menzies, these Asian genes are present in the Native American population because Zheng He's Chinese sailors mixed or intermarried with them. DNA science cannot pinpoint the date when these were acquired, but Menzies argues the eyewitness accounts date the DNA.
Now, the interesting thing is that all of these people I'm going to point out have recently acquired Chinese genes. Exactly, none of us know. What is recent? That's the $100 million question. People of Greenland, people of the Aleutians, the people of Yucatan Peninsula, the Incas. Now, if you look at some of those peoples, they're trees, DNA trees. The people of the Aleutians, the people of Greenland, the people of the Yucatan Peninsula, and the people of Peru, they are so close to Chinese genes, you might almost say they're Chinese. I agree that you can't date it 20 generations, 30 generations, or whatever. But I can show in every single place, those fleets settled, that people today have Chinese or Japanese or Mongolian genes. So I can't, at the moment, be proved wrong. Now, when they find a way of dating DNA, they might say, I'm wrong. But at the moment, nobody can date it.
According to Menzies, the Ming fleet did not stop with the discovery of America.
So it takes a bit.
He says the Chinese were also the first to circumnavigate the world.
This here.
Menzies cites one document which does state that the Chinese fleet visited no less than 3,000 lands. Menzies' source is a written copy of a stone carving that has now been lost. Mr. Wu is a calligrapher who has copied the words of the lost inscription many times.
The fleet set sail from Taichung, visited Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Calicut, and Hormuz, etc. Altogether, it says 3,000 countries. But this is a very easy confusion. This is how you write 10, and the character for 1,000 has an extra stroke on top. The two characters are very similar, so easy to confuse.
Wu has compared this with one other carved stele which has survived from the 15th century. Erected by Zheng He himself, it clearly states 3 times 10, therefore not 3,000, but 30 lands.
Well, I don't think 30 makes any sense at all. If it was merely 30, it would show fairly restricted voyages by not that many ships. It just wouldn't make sense. Because they clearly, by their own history, they got to a hell of a lot more countries than 30.
So the stone stele are wrong, or?
I just don't know enough about the stone stele. I wouldn't really like to comment.
The discovery of a Chinese tombstone has brought other facts to light. In his book, Menzies names the eunuch Zhao Wen as the admiral responsible for the exploration of the North American East Coast.
Menzies says Zhou Wen went to America. Now, Zhou Wen was an officer from Taichung. We have his tombstone. He did go on the voyages with Zheng He, but on his tombstone it says clearly that he was called back early in the middle of the journey.
It says that he was recalled halfway through his journey in 1421. And the source for this is Mr. Wu, who discovered the tombstone, is now curator at the museum, and is backed up by 3 other scholars, who, by the way, are not hostile to your central thesis.
Okay, well, I'll accept what they say.
But if Zhou Wen wasn't sailing up America to Greenland and the Arctic, I mean, who was?
His deputy.
Do we know who that was?
No. But somebody was in charge. Fleets don't float around on their own.
And it doesn't worry that it wasn't Zhou Wen?
Not terribly.
Many Chinese scholars who are keen to keep an open mind on Menzies' theory nevertheless remain skeptical.
Where did the fleet go? Chinese records do not say it went beyond Cape of Good Hope, so I cannot claim otherwise. Zheng He's fleets were far superior to Columbus or Magellan, but we knew nothing about America. We did not even know the world was round.
Chinese scholars have not looked into what is really there. They have accepted the mistranslation to say, oh, well, it's all too difficult. You know, we can't get records, and there aren't any records, and that's absolute nonsense.
We have 3 eyewitness accounts, 2 stone stele and the charts. I don't agree with the theory that all the documents were burned. Of course, we lost the logs, but the main events are clear.
What I have done is given a sufficient shake-up in China so that they jolly well know they can't anymore say it's rubbish. The details might be wrong, but the overall driving thrust of the book is absolutely right.
To have a new theory, one must have evidence to support it. The evidence can be historical archives or archaeological findings. If you have neither, you can't say your theory is up to the test. Menzies' conclusion has no evidence.
Undeterred, Gavin Menzies is financing further research into the ultimate destination of the Starfleet. He has set up a website and has been inundated with fresh theories from thousands of enthusiasts.
Every week, every minute, on average, somebody comes to our website, querying, suggesting, disagreeing. We have a fantastic volume of traffic to our website. We've had 36,000 emails with new evidence.
Menzies asserts that the Chinese rounded the Cape of Good Hope in August 1421. He is dead wrong. There's not a shred of evidence. It is pure fiction.
I feel it is only a matter of time before it is accepted worldwide that essentially that story is true. And what I say in the book will no longer be considered fanciful or long shot. Everyone will accept it's common sense that I was right.
I find a book like that to be extremely entertaining, but I take no serious stock of it. I'm afraid that a lot of people will accept many, or if not most, of the assertions that are in the book because they can't identify the difference between science and pseudoscience.
Do any of the points we've raised today weaken your faith and your belief in the story?
None. Not one.
While controversy and speculation continue to whirl around the voyages of Zheng He and the Starfleet, one mystery does remain. It is the mystery that started Menzies off on his original quest. 70 years before Columbus, somebody seems to have mapped islands on the far side of the Atlantic. Was it the Chinese? If not, who was it? For the meantime, everyone does at least agree on how the story ends. Over the course of 30 years, the Ming fleet had sailed on 7 great voyages. At first, these exploits met with massive approval from the emperor and the people. The wealth and influence generated ensured the emperor's prestige. But the courtiers and officials who had advised against these adventures could only look on with growing disapproval.
The list of tribute was received by the protocol official who read out aloud to the emperor. Mother of pearl, sea mirror, rhino horn, ivory, unique southern incense, southern steppes grass, sea dates, crane incense.
The euphoria was to be short-lived. In 1424, the emperor died, and his successor was opposed to these grandiose schemes. The new emperor was to beach the Starfleet and reverse China's expansionist naval policy. And so China turned its back on the world. To prevent any backsliding, the logbooks of the great expeditions were burned. The great Admiral Zheng He was sidelined, his work undone. Whether or not he or his fleets ever saw the Atlantic Ocean or the hidden world that lay beyond it, his known achievements already dwarfed those of most others. As for China, for almost half a millennium it abandoned the sea and turned in on itself. It is only now in recent years that China has begun to re-engage with the world it might once have dominated, and Admiral Zheng He has become a national hero once more.